So my name is Stacy Ashmore Cole. I normally go by Stacy Cole, but because my maiden name is Ashmore and it's a big part of this story, I use it for anything to do with they had names. I'm here today to tell the story of how I came to create this website called They Had Names, African Americans in Early Records of Liberty County, Georgia. This is the website. I'm a retired federal bureaucrat whose career had nothing to do with genealogy or American history, and this was definitely an unexpected twist in my life's journey. But why tell my story? Why not just talk about the website? I mean, it's just one story among a lot of stories. Well, I hope that it will inspire other people who think they may be descended from enslavers to look more deeply into their family histories and to pull out the parts that may help the people who are descended from the enslaved. I'm going to show how I turned out, even as a newbie genealogist, to have information that would have been almost impossible to find for the people who were descended from the people held in slavery by my ancestors. And I'm also going to show you the records I've found along the way that may spark an idea for you of places to look for information about your ancestors, enslaved or not, and tell some of the surprising stories I've found along the way, because like everyone, I started this with preconceived notions. It may be a bit of a whirlwind tour, I'm afraid, since there's a lot to talk about. First, let me define some terms. In this talk, you won't hear me use the word slave, and that's because that word defines people by their condition, and it's a passive word. The term I'll use is enslaved man or woman, person or people, or I'll say that someone was being held in slavery. I'll also say that someone was an enslaver or was holding someone in slavery. And if those terms sound awkward to you compared to slave or slave owner, well, they did to me too at the beginning. And then one day I thought about it like this. Every day, both the enslaver and the enslaved had to wake up and renegotiate that situation. Every day, the enslaved person thought, is this the day I'm going to run away? Is this the day I'm going to disobey and get whipped? Is this a day when I'll just do what I have to do to get by? Every day, the enslaver woke up and thought, is this the day they're going to rise up and kill me and my family? That was a constant fear, justified, especially after periodic uprisings. So the enslaver woke up every day and thought, maybe not specifically, but they were aware, what do I need to do today to show my power so that they don't run away or disobey? Or how do I use the rewards and punishments that I have to keep them in line? It was a constant, active negotiation. It was not a passive situation. The words enslaved and enslaver help us both keep that in mind and then constantly remind ourselves that these were human beings. The crux of my story today is that enslaved people were property in the eyes of the law, and you will find them in all the records where you will find other property, in wills, in estate inventories, in deeds of sale, deeds of gift, being used as collateral for securing loans, in marriage contracts. It's hard for us in our day to hear people talked about as property, especially if you're descended from them. But we have to face it. All of us have to face it in order to be able to find their names and ensure that they're not forgotten. Many people think that there are not many records available for African American genealogy from before the Civil War. The truth is that if the records exist for the enslavers, they exist for the people held in slavery by them. They're the same records. If a record type talks about property, it includes enslaved people when that's applicable. It's thought that many enslaved people did use surnames among themselves, known or not known to the enslaver. Normally, those would not be included, though, in a legal document. So if all you know of your enslaved ancestor is that his first name was Robert or her first name was Mary, and especially if you don't know who the enslaver was, the task of looking through all those records is just enormous. And each person doing the searching for Robert or Mary has to look through all those records. That's what the They Had Names project was intended to help with. And it's just one county, but it's a start. The records vary only slightly between counties, a little bit more between states. But I hope that telling you about Liberty County records will help you find similar records in your area of interest. Since this project is rooted in Liberty County, though, let me tell you a little bit about it and my connection with it, since this is a very personal story for me. Liberty County is located on the Georgia coast. If you're not from here, I know some of you are, some of you aren't. In the middle map here, it's the area in red. Oops, middle map, there should be 3 maps. Savannah, which is in Chatham County, is just to the north of Liberty County. I live in Brunswick, which is where Pete is too at the library, which is in Glenn County, about an hour south. I didn't grow up in Georgia, as you can probably hear from my voice. I knew, though, or thought I knew, that my family was from Brunswick. But it turns out when I started researching that my father's paternal side, the Ashmore side, was from Liberty County, which I'm sorry, I had never heard of before. I started researching going back to the 1750s, and they didn't move to Brunswick until the 1930s. My maiden name, as I've said, was Ashmore, and there have been Ashmores on this coast since early colonial times. During colonial times, Georgia was divided into parishes, and St. John's Parish in the Midway area was where most of the plantations and slave owners were concentrated, and that's where a unique culture grew up that was created and sustained by the mostly West African people who were brought here by force to live and work in these, if you live here, you know the climate conditions. The coast from North Carolina to Florida is now known as the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor because of this unique culture. The English colony of Georgia was originally established with a ban on slavery and actually on lawyers. It was intended as a buffer between South Carolina, where slavery was legal, and Spanish Florida, where people enslaved in South Carolina used to go to flee slavery. Other reasons why it was set up as a buffer state as well. Around 1750, Georgia lifted its ban on slavery, and a group of European-descended planters from around Dorchester, South Carolina, started migrating to the Midway area of Liberty County. They brought with them about 3 times their number and enslaved people who were mostly from West Africa. Most histories of Midway area focus on those white planters, but the truth is that Liberty County has been majority African American since that time, and West Africa has had a huge influence on the area's culture. That's not my story to tell, but you can find plenty of resources about it online and in books. Liberty County was named Liberty County after the American Revolution because its planter class basically dragged Georgia, the rest of Georgia, into the war, kicking and screaming, into the war on the American side. People like Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall, they were all prominent in the revolutionary movement, and they were from Liberty County. So that all sounds like a long time ago, and frankly, so does the Civil War. But slavery did not take place in the distant past. My great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, was born in 1869, just after the Civil War. His father owned people. He knew people who were born into slavery and had become free. My great-grandfather died in 1950 when my dad was 16. My dad knew his grandfather well. His grandfather was a steamboat captain on the Altamaha River on the Georgia coast, and his crew was made up of African Americans whose parents had been enslaved. In later life, he was actually the captain of the ferry boat between Brunswick and Jekyll Island before the causeway was built. So my dad had regular access to a man who grew up knowing people who had been enslaved and did not pass down any stories to me, unfortunately. But it's almost unimaginable to think that something so horrible was so recent, but it really was. So now for my personal story. I started researching my Liberty County ancestry in 2017 after I got bored in retirement and I was looking for something to do, and boy, did I find it. As I mentioned, my Ashmore family goes back to the 1750s in Liberty County, but I really didn't know much about them except the steamboat captain part, and that his brother had been the chaplain of Georgia's Confederate Army's 25th Regiment. But a lot of cousins I didn't know yet had done work on the family in the genealogy website Ancestry. A newfound cousin gave me a copy of my 4th great-grandfather's will, which you see here on the screen. He died, it was from 1841, he died in 1849. The will named 11 people he was holding in slavery, and you see them listed here. I knew intellectually, of course, that my Georgia family were likely to have been enslavers, but seeing the actual names had a huge emotional impact. And I decided to see if I could find out what happened to them. I was curious whether any of them took the Ashmore surname after the Civil War and what it might mean, why they did or didn't. I knew that the 1870 census was the first census after the Civil War, so it was the first one in which a freedman would have appeared with his chosen surname. And that's where I found him, Toby Ashmore, with his wife Elizabeth and his children. Toby was in the 1841 will. I started looking for more information about Toby Ashmore. I found Freedmen's Bank records. The Freedmen's Bank was set up after the Civil War to serve the freed people, but it also served refugees and others who needed banking services. Sandy Maybank and Andrew Law, in separate accounts, listed Toby Ashmore as their brother and Sibby as their mother, along with other siblings, and the names were the same as the ones in John Ashmore's will. Sibby West was listed as Sandy's mother and Sibby Ashmore as Andrew's mother. They were the same person, just with different surnames. This led me to understand that of the 11 people named in that 1841 John Ashmore will, 8 were a family. Sibby was their mother, and 6 others were Toby's siblings. It appears that in the 1871 Freedmen's Bank record, the earlier one, several of them were either using the Ashmore surname or that's just how Sandy Maybank knew them. And by 1872, the second one with Andrew Law, only Toby was using that surname. He turned out to be the only one of the 11 who kept using the Ashmore surname. And I still don't know what it means that the others didn't use that surname, but I do know what it means that Toby Ashmore did. First, though, I had mentioned that once I found Toby Ashmore, I realized that I had already found information about him that would be almost impossible for his descendants to find. A cousin of mine had written about Toby's death in 1877, saying in less than 2 weeks after Strong's death, Daddy Toby died. You knew our old Daddy Toby, I think. Grandma raised him with her own children, and we all felt like another of the family was gone. At the time, I was hopeful that this meant that my Ashmore family was one of the, quote, good slave owners, the term I used at the time. It turned out there was an entirely different reason why he was raised as one of the family. I had also been given a copy of records of the church my ancestors attended in the early 1800s, and I realized that Toby had been baptized there in 1830. That's the other record you see here. After I put together as much information as I could find, I decided to reach out to people on Ancestry who had Toby Ashmore in their tree. And that's one way to find someone like this, is look for people who have that person in their tree and then go right to them, since presumably they're related or interested at least. I figured his descendants could find him in the 1870 census as easily as I could. By this time, though, I had discovered more information about him from those cousins, and I wanted to share it. One of the people who responded was Charlie, Toby's second great-grandson. We exchanged information, we met in person, we became friends. He was kind enough to give me access to his DNA, and that was when we discovered that we were also family. It's been a joy and a privilege to be his cousin, though I wish it could have been under other circumstances. And in case anyone is wondering what I mean by that, I'll be explicit. It means that my ancestor, probably my 4th great-grandfather, was Toby's father. This was extremely common. Most African Americans carry some European DNA from an enslaver who assaulted their female ancestor. We all know it's a terrible thing for human beings to be in total control or have absolute power over other human beings, and this is how that played out in slavery. Charlie was willing to look past the circumstances to befriend me, but one of the reasons I created the website was so that people in Charlie's shoes could find the information themselves without having to process talking to an enslaver's descendant about it first. Here are a couple of other things that motivated me to start this project. One was the realization that genealogy has a shameful past. There have been a lot of projects like mine in the past that transcribe or abstract old records for people, other people doing genealogy. That includes the Georgia Genealogical Magazine, which in the 60s and 70s published abstracts of many of these same types of records. They normally left out the names of the enslaved people or even the fact that there were enslaved people mentioned in the record. So this is the abstract from that magazine of my fourth great grandfather's will. The only reason it even mentions that there were enslaved people is because of an unusual codicil. Codicil, I don't know how to pronounce it. Actually, his son Daniel was the eighth person admitted to the Georgia State Insane Asylum. And the codicil was to say what was to happen to his people if he didn't get out of there. Um, so this was the start of my project, actually. It made me so mad that I decided to go find all those Liberty County wills and put the missing names on lines for their descendants to find. Once I did that, I just kept finding more records and I kept going. I have to mention that although the genealogy world has gotten so much better, it's still way too common to go to a genealogy education presentation and hear all about European American ancestors and nothing to acknowledge that there were other people here. For example, a couple of years ago, I attended a great presentation about migration routes in early America without a word about the forced migrations of Africans. Of course, there's a lot of reasons for that, why people would do those kinds of presentations, but really it's time in 2024 for that to stop. Another thing that motivated me, I had started reading everything I could about Liberty County history, and I realized that so much of what I was reading omitted or minimized the contribution that African Americans made to building Liberty County. They created the wealth that allowed those Liberty County planters to have such an outsized influence on American political life. But that, and especially their names, were rarely mentioned in the history books. For example, the picture in the center is William McWhirr. During his lifetime, he was a famous Liberty County educator and clergyman. He moved from Scotland to America just after the Revolutionary War, and he went first to Virginia, where he actually taught George Washington's nephews, and he exchanged letters with George Washington, and he dined out on that story for the rest of his life after he moved to Liberty County. The available biographical information about him makes it sound as though he had a comfortable life because of his earnings from his teaching career. In fact, he married a wealthy widow who owned enslaved people, and he used the profits from selling them to finance his way of life. He traded one of those enslaved people for a man named Daniel, who was his body servant for the rest of his life. He died at the home of Roswell King, one of his former students, who some here will know as a notorious overseer of the Butler Island plantation near Darien. The biographical information on it makes it sound like his former students welcomed his visits. In fact, Cornelia Jones Pond, who wrote a lightly disguised memoir of her life in Siberty County, makes it clear that she really hated and feared him and said that Roswell King despised him but could not turn him away. So that's the whole story, not the whitewashed story that is normally told about historical figures like this. And these stories are the rule, not the exception. So as I find corrections, I've been adding them to the website as I find them. When I first decided that I wanted to put the records online, I started a free blog. I was thinking that a blog is essentially a searchable database, right? So I started with the wills that I mentioned that had the names missing. I found the original of the wills online and I found the names that were missing, and I added each will with the added names, and that became a blog post, each one a blog post. Where did I find the wills and the other documents? Here's a list. The genealogy website Ancestry has pretty much all the records I've been looking at, but I used FamilySearch.org, which for anyone who doesn't know is the website of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, because genealogy is very important for their religion. They have a huge amount of records on their website, and everything they do is free to the public. And I want people to go, when they see my abstract or transcription, I want them to go to the original because, mistakes. And so I don't want to send them to a website that they have to pay to have access to. I also found some records, particularly the colonial ones, at the Georgia Archives Virtual Vault, and others through the kindness of people who were strangers when I reached out to them. So far, everything I've accessed has been online. A lot of genealogy educators will tell you it's very important to go in person, and it is. You'll find more things, but I have found more than enough stuff to keep me busy over the last however many years without going in person. Unfortunately, most of these original records, even though they're digitized on Family Search and Ancestry, at that time at least, they were only indexed by the names of the primary person, in this case, the enslavers. Ancestry is changing that, and a lot of the records now are indexed, have all the names. But even with the new indexing they're doing, you're dependent on the skill of the indexer, and you're still taken to a handwritten record that a lot of people have trouble reading. So putting the transcripts and the abstracts of these records into a searchable format was the goal of this project. And I'll talk in a minute about how AI may be changing things, but it is still in its infancy. Decades ago, Family Search, as probably most of you know, or rather its predecessor organization, went around microfilming all kinds of records from county courthouses all over the country. And in recent years, they've digitized all those microfilms and the records are online. Until very recently, you couldn't search them except for the person that the record was about. But they've started using AI in an experimental process to basically transcribe the records for certain record sets and make them searchable. But these are still handwritten records, and the transcription is still very imperfect. So right now, the only way to do what I've done is to page through the records and look for the ones that read them all, look for the ones that name enslaved people. By the way, Family Search is completely free. All you need to do is create an account, and I highly recommend it. This is an example of what you'll find on their website or Ancestry's when you can't search, of course, because you're looking for particular things. You can maybe see that in this record set, there are 578 images. Each one's handwritten, and there are a lot of record sets. A record set is essentially a courthouse book, a deed book, a book of wills, etc. So it's taken years now for to go through all of these records. And what motivated me is the realization that every single person looking for a name in these documents would have to do that. Instead, I could do it and create a resource that could shave years off everyone else's research and free them up to focus on their research. So we're back to the website now. You can explore it at your leisure if you're interested. Even if you're not researching Liberty County itself, the website should give you ideas about what might be available for your area of interest, because after all, we can't find records if we're not aware they exist. So some details about the numbers and types of records. This is a community-focused project, not focusing on individual family lines. Instead, we're putting all the records for this county that name African Americans online. So there are probate records, there are church records, there are Southern Claims Commission transcripts. I'll talk about that in a minute. All told, we now have documents with over 39,000 references to named African Americans. Mostly antebellum records. There are some from after the Civil War also. So doing all those abstracts and transcripts is a lot of work, and I'm just one person. Enter Kathy Dillon. Many of you know Pete. He's here today. He's currently the CGGS president. Kathy, his wife, volunteered to help transcribe records, and she did that for 3 years, working on it most every day, and purely out of generosity. She has no connection to Liberty County. She continued to do it until I ran out of things to transcribe, since I mostly abstract things now or put them in spreadsheets. And this project could not have gotten where it is without her generous help. And she is truly appreciated. She has helped so many people that she'll never meet. Thank you, Kathy. Back to the types of records on the website. If you go to the website and you look at this list, it will show you what kinds of records you should be looking for in the county you're interested in. So we're going to dig into the records, which is what you see here, that help with researching enslaved people. And there are 2 ways you might be coming at this. One might be that you're descended like me from the enslavers and you find a record with the name of enslaved people and you want to find out what happened to them and hopefully pass that along to their descendants. The other is that you're one of those descendants and you're trying to find out what happened to them during slavery. I'm going to approach it from that second standpoint in this next part, but the information will help for both approaches. First, of course, you'll want to trace the person back through federal census records to the 1870 census. Carefully note any surname changes during that time. This is not an easy task, but we only have limited time today, and there's plenty of educational resources out there to help with doing that. So that's all I'm going to say about census research. Once you've found your subject in the 1870 census, and hopefully have noted his or her immediate family and maybe siblings and parents and also the neighbors, it's time to think about bridging what they call the 1870 brick wall. That's identifying the last enslaver, the person who was holding them in slavery at the time they were emancipated. You have to have that information to be able to trace them back into slavery. I'm not going to pretend that's easy because it definitely is not. What I said about identifying family and neighbors is very important because if you can't identify your ancestors' last enslaver, you might be able to figure out who that was for family members, associates, and neighbors, Elizabeth Shown Mills Fan Club, friends, associate, neighbors. Be careful though with that. This is Toby Ashmore in the 1870 census. Above him is Frank Williams, who I know was also enslaved by John Ashmore from the research I've done. For a while, I thought that Abram Houston below him was the Abram in the 1840 will because they lived so close together. But I sat down and went through all the records and proved he couldn't have been. So this takes patient, careful work. Up until recently, I would have said that only about 10% of freed people in Liberty County took the surname of the last enslaver, which I'm not going to say unfortunate, but it makes it more difficult when you're trying to figure out who the last enslaver was. Now, though, I know that's true, but it was actually much more true in Liberty County's 15th district, where most of the larger plantations were located, and in the 17th district, where the white residents tended to be smaller families, merchants, and they owned fewer people per capita. It was much more common to take the last enslaver's surname. I don't know the reason for that exactly, but you definitely need to know your county and to study its history in order to be able to do this. So remember, as the Civil War got closer geographically to people, some enslavers took their enslaved people and they went elsewhere, or they took them somewhere and then came back themselves. They called it refugeeing them. In Liberty County, some people were taken particularly to Thomas County out of the path of Sherman's army as they were heading towards the Georgia coast in late 1864, early 1865. You can see in the map at the top, you can see that Sherman's army's path in the blue lines from Atlanta to the coast. And so they would take people out of Liberty County and down south to Thomasville or Thomas County. In other places in the South, people might be taken as far away as Texas, and they might or might not come back afterward. And then, of course, huge disruption during that time. And so some people left, they came back, they left. You really have to know the history of the Civil War in that particular county. So, whoops, too far. Using federal records to research your enslaved ancestors can give amazing results. For example, the Southern Claims Commission was set up in the early 1870s so that the U.S. government could compensate loyal Southerners, in quotes, who had property taken from them by U.S. soldiers during the war. Claimants had to do an application, give detailed testimony, and bring witnesses. In Liberty County, some enslaved people did own small amounts of property because of the labor system there, which was called the task system, which I won't go into, but just Google task system and you can find out more about it. The soldiers took everything from everybody, white or black. So actually, most of the claimants for the Southern Claims Commission from Liberty County were African American, because most of the white residents were not what the U.S. government would call loyal Southerners. So they were not eligible for the program, and you did have to prove it. Kathy and I have transcribed about 70 of those claims in full, and I've researched about 40 of the claimants, and all that information is on the website. And doing that led me to the work of Dr. Peggy Hargis, which is what you see on the screen. She's a retired associate professor with Georgia Southern University. She compiled a list of all the formerly enslaved claimants and witnesses in the Liberty County Southern Claims Commission files. That's about 275 people with the names of their last enslavers because they had to say that for the testimony. So I found that list at the Dorchester Academy African American Museum in Liberty County and contacted her, and she gave me permission to use it. So I created a sortable spreadsheet that's on the website. That's what's on the left in the slide. These claims also represent some of the few documents we have in which the formerly enslaved people of Liberty County were able to express their feelings about slavery in their own words, probably their own words, and just a few years after formal slavery ended for them. So the statements are very moving, and just in, if it happens to be one of your ancestors, it's incredible to find this. Even if it's not one of your ancestors, very likely your ancestor felt the same way. In federal censuses for 1860 and before, enslavers were identified as enslavers or slave owners. In 1850 and 1860, there were separate censuses called slave censuses. Before that, the information was given in the regular census. No names were given, only numbers and ages. And these censuses are mainly useful for identifying the possible enslavers in that area. But you have to remember, it was only every 10 years, and a lot could happen in the meantime. So someone could become an enslaver after one and no longer by the next. So they're useful, but really be careful of them. I wish I could give more help on breaking through the brick wall today, but it's a topic for a course in itself. And it really depends on what was going on in that particular county and whether your ancestors stayed in the same county as the last enslaver, et cetera. So I wish you the best of luck with that. It's key to everything else that I'm going to talk about now. Once you've determined the last enslaver, it's time to start looking at the courthouse records. And the research, at this point, it's the standard genealogy research process. But what kinds of records would name enslaved people? When someone who owned people wrote a will, sometimes they would name particular enslaved people. In my fourth great grandfather's case, he appears to have named everybody and he divvied them up among his heirs. Other enslavers might just name a few favored people and then give out the rest in bulk to someone or call for them to be divided equally among their heirs, which is where the estate inventory and division would come in. If you find a case where just a few people have been named, ask yourself, why would they have been singled out? So sometimes it would be an elderly person who was special to the will writer. I mean, there could be a variety of reasons, but consider the other possibilities. In this case, John Goulding, a Revolutionary War veteran, freed 5 young enslaved people. And actually, I didn't put it in here, but he actually left them the other enslaved people if for some reason his white heirs were not able to do that. So why would he do that? Well, here's a likely clue. John Goulding was suspended from his church in 1770 for keeping his own wench, meaning his own enslaved woman. So he was probably those children's father. This was not at all uncommon. Usually it was known within the family, both the white and the black family, but of course that knowledge can be lost over the years. Sometimes it was actually specified in the will. And here's a case of that. Joseph Hargraves was born in Liverpool, England, and he moved to Charleston in the early 1800s to work as a merchant. He married a wealthy Liberty County woman who had inherited enslaved people and a plantation, and he moved there, and his wife died pretty quickly into the marriage, but he stayed. In 1825, he wrote his will. Amazingly, for the time, he left a quarter of his estate to a young enslaved boy named Shadrach, whom he freed. You see here that he names him as his son. Well, that's not in the will that was in the courthouse. He also left $100 each to enslaved women named Vina and Nanny. And I wondered about that because the copy I found didn't say it was his son. I assumed he was, but how could you prove that? So in going through court records, I found a lawsuit in which Joshua Hargraves, who was Joseph's nephew in Liverpool, and he had inherited the other 3/4 of the estate, he sued the executor because, of course, he didn't want Shadrach to inherit that quarter of the estate. The lawsuit had attached to it the original will. So that's the part that said this about Shadrach being his son. When they record after the lawsuit, when they recorded it in the court, they redacted those parts. It also asked that the executor be Shadrach's guardian. I know you'll be surprised to know that did not happen. And that he sent him to England for an English education. Well, that part did happen. Shadrach was sent to Liverpool. I found the estate account in which the executor paid $3 to send him to Savannah to board a ship. When he got to Liverpool, Joshua Hargrave seems to have taken him into the family, and when Joshua died, he left Shadrach some money, and he acknowledged him as Joseph's natural son. Shadrach used the money to start a brewery, which had been Joshua's occupation. He married, he had a son whom he named Shadrach Bina Hargraves after his mother. Unfortunately, his son doesn't appear to have had any children because I would like to have told them that story. Another hugely valuable record of slavery is estate inventories, as you'd expect. After an enslaver died, his or her estate needed to be inventoried and appraised, that is, valued. 3 people, usually neighbors who also held enslaved people, so they knew market values, would be appointed by the court to do it, and they'd list each person by name and value them. Sometimes they'll list ages and other identifying information like the state of their health. People in the prime of life and health were valued the highest. The elderly and the very young were valued the lowest. It's not uncommon, though heartbreaking, to see a very elderly person listed as worth nothing. Infants were never valued at 0 because of their potential value, usually $50 or so. It was not uncommon, and this is something to look for people to be listed in family order, even though that wasn't specified. So in Liberty County, at least, enslavers actually did try to keep families together if possible. They would separate families, including mothers from children, if it benefited them, but that wasn't the preference. So look at the inventories carefully. For example, this inventory doesn't include ages or family relationships, but notice that Margaret at the top is valued at $1,000, and then Augustus, Abram, and George are followed in order by value. And actually, you'll notice after that, kind of the same. Well, it is the same. If you see an estate inventory ordered like this, particularly if it happens in multiple cases in the estate inventory, note down the possibility that they might be a family. You still have to prove it. And I actually have found other information that says that these 4 people were a family. But this, I mean, just extremely valuable information. Deed records are the other really important set of documents in this project. Like the probate records, Family Search digitized them many years ago and they're online but not indexed, though the original handwritten or typewritten indexes, you might find them in the digitized images, and those are very useful. They can help you find particular pages. So deed records naming enslaved people include bills of sale, marriage contracts in which a woman brings enslaved people into the marriage and they're put into trust for her, what are called chattel mortgages in which enslavers used their enslaved people as collateral on promissory notes, just like they used land or other property, and deeds of gift, in which parents or grandparents say gave enslaved people, often enslaved children, to their own children or grandchildren. These records are really time consuming to go through and abstract, but they're so worthwhile because they often contain details you can't find anywhere else. It was fairly common to give the ages of people, enslaved people, in the deed records, or say their trade, give their family relationships. You might have heard that enslaved people couldn't be married, and it's true that their marriages were not legal, but their unions, their marriages, were often acknowledged by the slave owners. And so you'll find so-and-so and his wife so-and-so in these records, and their children so-and-so. I've now abstracted all the deed records that name enslaved people in Liberty County from 1786 to 1865, and those abstracts are on the website. I've now also completed the deed records for Bryan County from 1796 to 1840, and eventually I'm going to get to it for 1840 through 1865. Life in early Liberty County, like the rest of early America, was focused around the church. In this case, it was the Midway Congregational Church, which was founded in 1752. That church, you see it on the right there, it exists today. The current building dates from 1792. The earlier building was actually burnt by the British during the Revolutionary War. It operated as a church from 1752 to 1867, and it had both white and black members from its earliest days, like a lot of churches around here did. And the black members followed the same process for membership as the white members did, and the church kept great records. The records of the white members were published years ago in a book by James Stacy, and it only mentioned a few African Americans, so I just assumed that the records didn't name them. But in fact, there were quarterly session meetings in which they recorded new memberships, departures for other churches, and disciplinary cases. And those all included African Americans. And I just found them by accident online, purely serendipitously. So I went through them and pulled out the references to African Americans. There were actually, over that time period, there were 3,889 references to named African American members in those records, both enslaved and free. So on the right is what those records look like. This is the handwriting that you've got to read through. This is the earliest reference to a named African American member in the record, Scipio and Judy, who became members on June 26, 1756. Isn't that amazing? The photo on the left is the second floor of the church, which is the slave gallery where the enslaved people worshiped. I turned those references into a sortable spreadsheet with those 3,889 references and started a project to recreate the African American member list from this and from researching the members and other records. Looks like there were a total of about 1,200 to 1,400 African American members over that time period. The church disbanded in 1867, and actually the African American members came to the church and said, we want to start our own church, and they leased the building. They essentially saved the church building after the Civil War. In another great example of church records, and you need to look to see if there's something like this for your county. In 1846, a white preacher named Charles Colcock Jones made a census of every African American member of a church in Liberty County's 15th district, which is where most of the plantations were. So there are 1,146 people named on the list. The top image here on the slide is the people held in slavery by my Ashmore, by my ancestor, John Ashmore, the ones who attended church. And you see Toby's name on that list, and he attended the North Newport Baptist Church, which later became the first African Baptist church, the oldest African American church in Liberty County. So you see the 5 names on that list, and they were attending different churches. And this was one of the most surprising things to me, that church membership, whether you attended and which church, was a choice for at least some enslaved people in Liberty County. The list on the bottom is that list I mentioned for the Pleasant Grove Church, which is where my ancestors attended, and Toby also attended previously. They were still attending it by 1846, and he had chosen to move to another church. The church records are, of course, not just membership registers. Brian Hecker from the Columbia Theological Seminary went through the Liberty County records, and he gave me pastor's diaries and a record that Charles Colcock Jones actually kept of his meetings with his watchmen, as he called them. They were enslaved deacons who were set to watch other enslaved people on plantations and report back. So I put those records on the website, but just enormously valuable documents that may be out there for your county. I found that 1846 census from a reference in a book called Dwelling Place by Dr. Erskine Clark, and I wrote to him, and he referred me to Tulane University, which had the original, and they kindly gave me a copy of it, and I put it into a spreadsheet that's online too. But you need to read everything you can about your county and look at the footnotes, because the person who's writing the book may not think it's important to, to tell you all the information about this. So here's an example of putting all these records together. In 1877, Newton Bacon, a freedman, testified in a Southern Claims Commission petition and said he had been owned by Robert Charlton Hines when U.S. soldiers came through Liberty County foraging at the end of 1864. Newton is a relatively uncommon name, so when I searched the They Had Names database, I found that I also found him named in Charlton Hines's 1864 estate inventory. So why did he take the surname Bacon if he was owned by a Hines? The search revealed the answer. It showed that he had been owned by the Bacon family as of 1851 when they used him as collateral on a promissory note, which they fortunately did not default on, otherwise he would have been sold at the courthouse. And in 1843, when Major John Bacon's estate was divided, and in 1834, when it was first appraised. Again, in Liberty County, most African Americans did not take the surname of their last enslaver, but often the surname they did take points to the history of their family, and it gives you a clue as to whose records you should be looking for in terms of the enslaver. The project also makes it possible to trace lines of enslavers and enslaved people for lengthy periods of time through complicated inheritance lines. We all know why that's important, to trace the lines of inheritance, to explain why this person, why did they go from being owned by a Bacon to being owned by a Hines. Here are 5 men from Liberty County and the dates they died. They all held people in slavery. So what else do they have in common? They were all married to this woman, Margaret Stacy. I don't know yet when she was born. I don't know when she died, but I found records for her with all 6 of the surnames she had between her marriage to Thomas Goulding in 1784 and her marriage to Williamson in 1818. I just didn't know that they were all for the same woman until I started putting, it all together. Also, it was common for women whose husbands died young, and they had young children to remarry quickly. But this one's kind of remarkable. She attended estate inventories for 2 husbands in the same year, if you catch my drift. So I'm a little curious about her. I've started using mind maps for research on people like this. Look how complicated this is to put this together. She had children with 2 of the husbands and took enslaved people with her from marriage to marriage and surname to surname. So trying to figure out where everybody ended up and how can be really complicated. And frankly, it's also risky because even though her story illustrates the benefits of an approach like this, since I found her records without realizing they were all for the same person, I probably never would have realized it without having the records in a searchable database. But it does illustrate the risks, especially with people who were known in the documents by only their first names, because it's so easy to see what we want to see and disregard the unknowns. So in this case, there was a Lucy and a Jim in John Croft's 1802 estate inventory, and there they were again in his 1815 estate inventory. And then we see Lucy and Jim again in her marriage contract with Nathan Williamson. But are those the same Lucy and Jim? Because there are also a Lucy and Jim in Stephen Hoyt's 1815 estate inventory. And remember, she was the estate administrator for 2 husbands in that year. And then in 1818, she gave a Jim and a Lucy to 2 grandchildren. In this case, she happened to specify that Jim and that Lucy were children themselves. So I think the first line here is probably correct. But if she hadn't mentioned that, well, you can see how easy it would be to make a mistake. So I hope at the very least I've made you want to visit Liberty County. Some places you'll want to see while you're there. The Dorchester Academy has an amazing civil rights exhibit. Martin Luther King used Liberty County as a major stop in his travels, and it played a significant role in the civil rights movement. The Midway Museum is located next to the Midway Congregational Church, and it tells the story of the white planters from that church and their role in the American Revolution. And then there's the Susie King Taylor Museum in downtown Hinesville. Susie King Taylor was held in slavery in Liberty County and Savannah, and she escaped during the Civil War. You may have heard her name recently because a square was just named for her in Savannah. She's the only African American woman to have written a memoir of her time in the Civil War when she traveled with the U.S. colored troops. And it's very cool that she was from Liberty County. Uh, I will the memoir is available free online. I'll put a link to it in your handout. She was an incredible historical figure, and so is actually the creator of the museum, Hermina Glasshill, who is a public historian who moved to Liberty County around the same time as I started researching there. She wanted to make sure that Susie King Taylor's story did not die, so you will not regret visit to that museum. Other people you need to know if you're researching genealogy in coastal Georgia. And Marty Miller, I forgot to put your name on this list, but Marty has a Facebook group. I will put that in the handout. Terry Ward and Adolphus Armstrong collaborate on McIntosh County and other neighboring counties, and also on the Coastal Georgia DNA Project, where they're partnering with MyHeritage to DNA test older members of the African American community. Amy Hedrick is the creator of the glengen.com website and Facebook group. She's been researching this area for over 20 years and has amazing records on her website. I already mentioned Hermina, but she is also the first African American president of the Liberty County Historical Society, which also has a website and a Facebook group. And I should mention that I have a Facebook group for the website, and I also have a blog. I blog occasionally, but it does happen, which you can receive. You can sign up to receive the blog via email on my website. So I'd love to be contacted by anyone who's interested in Liberty County records. I try to make sure that if we process records, I put them online right away, but I've learned a lot about how to research in Liberty County, and I'm happy to share that knowledge with anyone. So please don't hesitate to contact me. There's the email address.